This is an ABC podcast.
Hello, welcome to PM. I'm Linda Mottram. Tonight, the New South Wales Premier warns those holding off on vaccination they can't assume they'll get the same freedoms even once 80% of the eligible population are double-dosed. Also tonight, the grim realities overseas that have hit home in Western Sydney, driving one hotspot to the nation's highest vaccination rate.
What's going on back in the Philippines? Of course, most of us still have families there, friends. I personally have, in our family, there have been deaths due to COVID. I expect most of us in the community have had that experience.
And with vaccination rates in Africa at just 3%, we hear the case for Australia to do more there and head to Tanzania, where stalled safari tourism means additional hardship.
So many of the children's families and parents who come to our school, you know, they're porters or they're camp cooks, or they grow chickens that feed to a hotel, or maybe their auntie is a cleaner at a hotel. It's that whole domino effect.
Good evening, but we begin today with what appears to be some very good news out of New South Wales on the COVID front. After more than 11 weeks of lockdown across Greater Sydney, several leading epidemiologists say the curve has finally flattened. They point to high rates of vaccination, particularly in COVID red zones, as the key ingredient for success in bringing the outbreak under control. But they warn against complacency, stressing hospitalisations will continue to rise and vulnerable communities remain at risk. David Lipson has our report.
Week after week, the news in Sydney has been bad and getting worse. And 1,257 new cases for the state sounds like more of the same. But take a listen to this.
I think we've got really good sign that we are now seeing this curve flatten.
Epidemiologist Catherine Bennett from Deakin University says the graph showing the daily number of COVID cases, which has stubbornly pointed up for the past 11 weeks, has now plateaued. If that continues, a reduction in case numbers should be next.
It's fantastic news, and it's what you predict, it's what you hope to see, it's what we know from data overseas, but it's so fantastic to see it actually playing out this way in real time in our country.
She's not alone. Gregory Dorr is an epidemiologist from the Kirby Institute. Greg, have we hit the peak in New South Wales?
Hopefully we have. I mean, there's encouraging data over the last week that suggests that things have stabilised.
And Professor Adrian Esterman is from the University of South Australia.
I'm seeing the rate of growth of cases slowing right down, so it has all the signs of a peak, but the numbers aren't there to tell me it is a peak, and it won't be for a few days yet, but I'm very optimistic.
What do you put it down to?
I think it has to be vaccination. Nothing else has changed, really.
Professor Bennett agrees. Vaccination rates, especially in COVID hotspots, are now starting to crush the Sydney outbreak.
And these extraordinary week-on-week accelerations, particularly the vaccine uptake, even first doses, in those areas where there is most transmission in the community, absolutely appear to be making that difference. And we know UK data tells us you can expect a third less infection even 2 weeks after your first dose. So we're starting to see that real effort to lift the vaccination rate translate to better protection in the community, and that then translates to a much higher level of control.
46% of the state's population over 16 is now fully vaccinated. Almost 80% have had at least one dose. And those numbers are even higher in some of the COVID hotspots, where officials feared vaccine hesitancy would be hard to overcome.
Parts of southwestern Sydney went from 19% when the outbreak first started to nearly 90% now. Thank you for people who got over their fear of getting vaccinated, over their hesitancy, and now they're leading the state.
Premier Gladys Berejiklian notably hasn't mentioned any flattening of the curve yet.
We are seeing a stabilisation in some local government areas of concern, and that's positive. We hope that continues. However, we have seen also an increase in cases, as we mentioned yesterday and the day before, in the inner Sydney areas of Glebe and Redfern.
No longer holding 11 a.m. press conferences as a matter of course, Today she appeared anyway, describing it as a milestone day, with restrictions easing ever so slightly. Picnics and other outdoor gatherings are now allowed for up to 5 vaccinated people, as long as they're not in so-called areas of concern.
And so whilst people start enjoying some things they couldn't enjoy last week, I urge the community, please do not get complacent. Do not let your guard down, because any event that we don't anticipate or expect could see a major setback, and none of us want to see that happen.
One such setback could be a further slowing of vaccination rates. Talk of vaccine certificates to gain entry to pubs, cafes and gyms has no doubt helped turbocharge the pace of vaccination up until now. But on 2GB radio this morning, the Deputy Premier John Barilaro suggested they wouldn't be needed once the state hit 80% full vaccination.
When we get to 80% and above, we've said that according to the national roadmap and to the Doherty Institute report, we'll go and then lift further restrictions, including for the unvaccinated.
The Premier was quick and forceful in shutting him down.
The government is yet to finalise its plans in relation to what happens at 80% double dose. For those of you who choose not to be vaccinated, that's your choice, but don't expect to do everything that vaccinated people do, even when we hit 80%, and I want to make that very clear.
New South Wales is expected to hit 80% first dose coverage tomorrow and double dose coverage a month or two from now. But it'll be a rough ride to the finish line. Professor Catherine Bennett says the state may have reached the peak in terms of case numbers, but with hospitalisations and deaths expected to keep rising for some time yet, insists now is not the time to slow down in the race to vaccinate the nation.
I've used an analogy last year in Victoria that, we're cycling downhill now. The wind's on our back. Pedal harder. That's what this is about. We've now got a sense that we've got this wave under control in New South Wales. But it's not time to then sit back. It really is about, well, it's working. Let's use that to motivate us to do more faster.
Professor Catherine Bennett, David Lipson with that report. Well, the Delta outbreak has exposed disparities in access to COVID vaccines, but there's been a major turnaround in Western Sydney. In the federal electorate of Greenway, centred around the Delta hotspot of Blacktown, more than 90% of locals aged over 15 have had one dose of a vaccine. That's the highest rate in the country. It's partly because of bitter experience witnessed elsewhere, and concern does remain for pockets that are still unprotected. Gavin Coote reports.
For many locals in the Western Sydney suburb of Blacktown, it hasn't been a hard sell getting a COVID vaccine. The area has a large Filipino community, which Tess Sayers Travel Agency mostly caters for.
And most of the travels that we deal with are travel back to the Philippines or to other countries to visit families. And of course, with what's going on and with the declaration of Qantas, for example, where Qantas will not take flyers without being vaccinated, that sort of influenced a lot of people to get vaccinated, to be able to see their families again, to be able to visit, the Philippines again.
Sydney's west and southwest is still recording more than 700 daily infections, but there's another number that's offering a lot more hope. Vaccination rates are steadily climbing, and the federal electorate of Greenway, which includes Blacktown, now has the country's highest percentage of first doses given. More than 91% have had at least one COVID shot, and almost 47% are fully immunised. Tess Sayers doesn't find the high uptake all that surprising.
We are also affected with what's going on back in the Philippines. They are far worse off than Australia. Of course, most of us still have families there, friends. I personally have, in our family, there have been deaths due to COVID. And just recently, just 2 days ago, an elderly aunt died of COVID. And I expect most of us in the Filipino community have had that experience.
Since the beginning of the Delta outbreak in June, the vaccination rollout in Sydney's west has been hampered by supply problems and some frustration about a lack of vaccine safety information in different languages. Thairu Aramagan is a Tamil community leader in the Blacktown area and reckons now supplies have been shored up, there's every reason to think the rates will climb even further.
I would say that at this point that we might need religious group leaders to join us on this campaign. So we just need to work on that.
Late last month, a church in Blacktown was shut down for 7 days after almost 60 people gathered for a service in breach of the public health orders. And now some religious leaders in Sydney have said they'd be reluctant to turn away churchgoers who haven't been vaccinated once restrictions are eased. Michelle Rowland is the Labor member for Greenway.
I would want to make sure that if I go to a place of worship, that I am going to be in a safe environment. We're always trying to make sure we cater for people who are older, people who are younger, people from any background with any underlying illnesses. You have to make sure that there's a safe environment for all these people. So I think it's incumbent on every person of whatever faith to encourage people to get vaccinated so that we can all participate equally in gatherings and in demonstrating the worship of whatever God we worship.
Do you think there is that risk of potentially resting on our laurels and you could see pockets of the community still go unvaccinated in these high numbers?
I've seen reports already that rates generally are dropping, that people who want to get vaccinated, always wanted to get vaccinated, are probably getting vaccinated now, and that is petering out a bit. You're going to always have this cohort of people who will never get vaccinated for whatever reason. But you've also got that cohort of people who they need convincing. They're the people we really need to be targeting now.
Dr Kang Seng Lim shares those concerns. He's a GP in the nearby suburb of Mount Druitt, where vaccination rates are about 10% lower than in Greenway.
One of the things about vaccination is that we have to make sure we're getting it evenly spread across the whole community, because if we have little pockets or nests of unvaccinated parts of the population, these can actually act as a harbour where coronavirus, or in fact any other vaccine-preventable illness, could spread and multiply and then come back to affect the whole community.
Western Sydney GP Kang Seng Lim, Gavin Coote with that report. Well, there's still a way to go in Victoria's COVID outbreak, with case numbers growing at a much faster rate than was expected. The state government has announced construction workers will be prioritised for vaccination. The Health Minister, Martin Foley, says the industry is on notice with a high rate of transmission on building sites, but he's not yet shutting the industry down. Bridget Fitzgerald reports.
Despite the so-called hard and fast lockdown, the rise in daily case numbers for Victoria is showing no sign of slowing down. Victoria's Health Minister is Martin Foley.
It's unacceptably high, and it is a major concern for us.
Victoria's recorded its highest daily COVID case numbers since August last year, with 473 new locally acquired cases.
The numbers in Victoria are bouncing around a lot, so it's a bit hard to get a decent read, but I think we have to be sort of front up now that the spread is quite something here.
Melbourne University epidemiologist Professor Tony Blakely says Victoria's case numbers are growing faster than they were at around the same point in the New South Wales outbreak.
The sort of average daily increase in the last 2 weeks is now up at about 12%. That's pretty high. It was really about 5% per day increase in New South Wales through the midst of it.
The construction industry's been a major source of transmission. 13% of the more than 3,500 active cases can be linked to building sites. In an attempt to curb the spread, the state government announced that 20,000 appointments for the Pfizer vaccine would be reserved for construction workers over the next week. Compliance checks on building sites will be ramped up as well to ensure workers are doing the right thing. Treasurer Tim Pallas denied the industry was getting special treatment.
So this is not about special provision and exceptions for the construction industry. It's about recognising that they have an obligation to go that little bit further, given the opportunities that they have as permitted workers to continue to apply their trade.
The state opposition has criticised the government for putting construction workers ahead of other groups. Shadow Health Minister Georgie Crozier says teachers should be prioritised for vaccines.
Teachers should be deemed to be essential workers. Look at the amount of time our kids have been out of the classroom, and we've been saying that teachers should be absolutely prioritised to be vaccinated.
But Health Minister Martin Foley says some teachers have already been prioritised, including those at special schools and some teaching Year 12. He also says vaccine uptake has been higher among teachers than construction workers, though he was unable to provide any evidence of that.
Because they are younger, we would imagine they would reflect that same demographic of being underrepresented as per the age-based rollout of the program since it commenced in March.
While the Health Minister says the industry's on notice to lift compliance, it's clear the measures being taken are an attempt to keep the sector, which is already operating at reduced capacity, from shutting down completely. Rebecca Casson is the CEO of Master Builders Victoria.
The building and construction industry accounts for over 46% of our state's tax revenue. And for every single day that our industry might be locked down, the projected figures suggest that that's over $455 million every single day lost in revenue.
However, Rebecca Casson acknowledges there have been some issues with non-compliance among some operators, which was putting the entire industry at risk.
We do understand that there will be a zero tolerance approach, and we do understand that prohibition notices might be issued where appropriate. So we very much welcome that, because there might be people in our industry that aren't doing the right thing, and they should be held to account, particularly because we don't want them to bring down the rest of the industry.
Rebecca Casson is the CEO of Master Builders Victoria. Our reporter there, Bridget Fitzgerald. You're listening to PM on the radio, on the ABC Listen app and via the podcast. I'm Linda Mottram. Ahead, space tourism. Is it anything more than just an off-the-planet ego trip for billionaires?
It's helping to drive the growth of the private sector. It's inspiring people, and it gives people hope and aspirations. And when you think of just how much trouble there is in the world right now, I think we need that uplift, even if we're not actually going on the missions ourselves.
To space shortly, but first dose vaccination rates in higher income countries are now running at 80% on World Health Organization figures. But across lower income countries, they're at just 20%, and some are well below that. Take Tanzania, for example, in East Africa. It's a global magnet for lovers of Africa's wildlife in parks like the Serengeti and the Ngorongoro crater. But the crucial safari industry was hit hard when COVID stopped tourists from coming, and now vaccination rates are also an obstacle to the economy, sitting at barely 0.5% in that country. Well, what's it like? Gemma Sisia hails from the northern New South Wales town of Gaira, but she's long made Tanzania her home, where she established a school that runs for poor children, while her husband, well, he ran safaris. We spoke earlier.
Our last clients were in March last year, 2020. I actually took some of my Australian staff on a couple of days safari in July, and we were the only people besides one other car in the entire Ngorongoro crater.
And that's normally the peak season, right?
Yeah, normally you'd have, at least 100 vehicles in the Ngorongoro crater. Sadly, our government hasn't got the money to support a lockdown or support businesses, and not only safari companies have hurt, but it's all the feeder people and families and communities that feed into tourism. So many of the children's families and parents who come to our school, they're porters or they're camp cooks, or they grow chickens that feed to a hotel, or maybe their auntie is a cleaner at a hotel. It's that whole domino effect.
And you run the school, so you're, as you say, you're seeing this in the families of the children. How hard is it for them without that regular flow of tourism?
Oh, it's really sad. Driver guides are, coming to the house saying they're having trouble feeding their families. You're seeing really experienced driver guides, working with building companies, driving trucks of bricks and everything, where they should be, out taking tourists to the national parks. We actually had to, last year, do a few thousand food support packs for our families, because we were noticing that some of our children, they were losing weight.
Now, Tanzania has really struggled with the pandemic, hasn't it, as a country? I mean, misinformation about COVID has been a problem, misinformation about vaccines, fuelled in part by the former president.
There is a lot of conspiracy amongst our people here about why they shouldn't get vaccinated. More and more people are getting vaccinated slowly, because they're seeing people who got vaccinated, 5-6 weeks ago are still okay. But it's not a big talking point here. We've got malaria and we've got Ebola and we've got cholera and typhoid and everything, and people just get on.
Gemma Sisia speaking to me from Dar es Salaam in Tanzania. Well, the country's previous president peddled nonsense COVID remedies and also refused to accept vaccines, adding to his country's woes. Under a new president, Tanzania has now joined the COVAX vaccine facility and has taken delivery of 1 million single-dose vaccines from the United States. But there is still a long way to go. Mark Cubitt represents several philanthropic organisations that support development in Africa as part of the Australian International Development Network. We spoke earlier.
There's a lot of issues around COVID in Africa where I'm not sure what numbers you can believe as far as be it illness or fatalities, but the data on the vaccination rollout is pretty reliable, and it's showing only about 3% of the population has been able to get vaccinated so far. To put that in Australian context, that's similar to maybe the population of the ACT, for example.
Wow. So what's been the economic impact of the pandemic, but also of people not being able to get vaccinated or perhaps not wanting to get vaccinated as well?
You just have to say substantial, because when you're living we've all heard of the proverbial $2 a day. When you're living on $2 a day and suddenly you are unemployed effective immediately because you work in tourism or because your government has locked down your community, people just do start scrambling for the basics of life, like food. Look, I've been travelling to Africa for 15 years, and so I guess where I come from is more the impact on individuals, on families, on communities.
I mean, Gemma mentioned that the school where she runs had been doing food packages for some people because a lot of the children's families are indirectly often employed in tourism, and of course that's just evaporated, and that's shocking for them, isn't it?
Absolutely. And when I put my development hat on, I represent a number of foundations that support organisations in Africa. Sometimes welfare, if we could call it that, like a food package, seems to be the last thing that one would want to support. But if you can't feed people today, then they're not going to be around in the future to go to schools like the School of St Jude.
Now, at current rates, I'm seeing figures that say that without additional interventions, a batch of 20 lower-income countries will not reach vaccination rates like we're seeing in richer countries until 2030. I mean, that's a very disturbing figure, isn't it?
It absolutely is. That's where I think our government and governments of the wealthier countries need to step up, I should say. But our efforts are still quite meagre. Australia has given wonderful assistance to our Pacific neighbours, but we do only contribute 0.2% of gross national income to overseas aid. We've spent hundreds of billions of dollars supporting Australians through our hour of need. Now, to be very clear, we should have done that. I am glad we have done that. But if we as Australians want to go back out into the world in 2022, we need to take our Prime Minister at his word. Scott Morrison said, this is a global pandemic. It doesn't know politics. It doesn't know borders, and none of us will be truly safe until all of us are safe. Well, if Tanzania and Kenya are not safe, neither is Parramatta or Geelong. As we all understand, COVID does not respect national borders. Look, only late last week there was a Gates-funded study published in the journal Science. Their conclusion was that the slow rollout of vaccines in most African countries creates an environment in which the virus can replicate and evolve. So it was imported into Africa, and if we don't get the African population vaccinated rapidly, other variants could well be exported back out of there again.
So what specifically would you like to see Australia and Australians more broadly do?
We need to continue support of our local population, but we need to be more on the front foot as a government and as a country with contributing, be it vaccines, contributing even more funding to the COVAX facility. We need to be doing this to support and protect people in Africa and Southeast Asia and the Pacific, but also at the same time as a protection mechanism for our own country as well.
And what's your view, Mark, of the several occasions now on which the Australian government has announced that it's effectively borrowed extra vaccines from some countries? Is that a fair enough thing for Australia to be doing in the current context?
I would hope that question really answers itself. If one really wants to just spend a few minutes looking at what's happening in so many countries around the world, I don't think it puts us in a good light at all.
Mark Cubitt, thank you very much for joining us.
It's a pleasure. Thank you, Linda.
Mark Cubitt from the philanthropy-driven Australian International Development Network. Well, another billionaire is set to go where only a couple of other of the uber-wealthy have gone before, to space, or the edge of it at least. This time it's Jared Isaacman, the 38-year-old founder of the money processing company Shift4 Payments. He's not exactly a household name and he hasn't built his own spaceship, but he is set to blast off on board fellow billionaire Elon Musk's SpaceX rocket ship, along with 3 others, taking in the multi-million-dollar views from space. Nick Grimm reports.
10, 9, 8, 7.
If you were strapped to a rocket ship about to be shot into space, what would you pack for your off-planet holiday jaunt?
Liftoff of the Falcon 9 and Crew Dragon.
Well, for the 4 tourists set to become the world's first all-civilian space crew to go into full orbit, a ukulele has been deemed an essential piece of onboard luggage. Also along for the quick hop into space, 30 kilograms of the beer-making ingredient hops, the later brewing and sale of which will generate some of the proceeds helping to pay for this week's launch, though that's likely to be small beer compared to the lazy few hundred million believed to be getting kicked in by the billionaire Jared Isaacman, who's been given the title of Mission Commander for the fully automated SpaceX flight.
You know, it is the first time that a global superpower hasn't sent people up into orbital space. And I think that should send a message of all the things to come, right?
The brave new frontier of space tourism, though, underwhelms many scientists, with some suggesting the research benefits are too costly, too overhyped, or simply too dubious. At least the inspiration for flight will go much further into space than recent forays by billionaires Richard Branson and Jeff Bezos, higher too even than the Hubble Space Telescope and the International Space Station. Sridhar Thakur is a professor of operations management at America's Carnegie Mellon University.
I think if they can show this as improving broadly the technological capability for our society, that is, that in addition to the vanity project, the joyride, the ego of showing off, etc., that there is a positive externality, I think they can balance, I think, this this feeling of pure frivolousness.
So, prepare the lower right strut for you, Aki.
Good words, Toma. Should be under straps 7 and 8.
Of course, it's not as though being in space is really that big a deal nowadays.
It seems like the public is not well aware that there is a space station that's orbiting Earth 24/7, 365.
That's NASA's Anne Bathieu speaking for the 20th anniversary of the US agency's collaboration with the space station. Some argue that's where money would be better spent, and certainly the care and maintenance carried out by spacewalking astronauts in recent days doesn't come cheap. But the space station is also finding some innovative funding models itself nowadays, with the cast and crew of an upcoming Russian feature film set to go there soon to shoot their movie. Later this year, it's said Hollywood star Tom Cruise will do the same. It might get a little crowded above the Earth, of course, but as the Australian space analyst Dr. Maurice Jones argues, the more, the better.
All things considered, I'm surprised that it's all taking as long to happen as it has. This whole concept of having more people in space on private missions is probably at least a decade behind where I think we all expected it to be. We knew it was coming, but the industry has had some economic problems, some technical problems, and also some political problems. But I think we're finally showing the promise that we've all been hoping for.
And as far as space travel is concerned, is it useful?
It's definitely useful. the fact of the matter is that we could not sustain our current civilization without space travel. We depend on it for communications, environmental monitoring, defence. If you were to eliminate spaceflight from our lives, we would suddenly find ourselves back into the Stone Age.
Space analyst Dr Maurice Jones speaking with Nick Grimm, and that is PM for this Monday. I'm Linda Mottram. Thank you for listening. You can hear us on the ABC Listen app live or later, or subscribe wherever you get your podcasts. And while you're there, check out The Signal. It's an ABC News podcast weekday mornings, analysing one big story for you.
You've been listening to an ABC podcast. Discover more great ABC podcasts, live radio and exclusives on the ABC Listen app.